All right. Welcome in to a special edition of Check the Mic. No Steve Palazzolo here, but that's in large part because the last time we talked about the New Orleans Saints and their salary cap situation, a whole load of people told me I needed to get educated. So enter stage left, Jason Fitzgerald from the great website overthecap.com. Nobody better to educate me on what is going on with the Saints salary cap. And it's a perfect time to be doing it because Dennis Allen has been fired. Marshon Lattimore has now been traded away. So, Jason, you, I think, are the perfect guy to come in and help me navigate all of this mess.
I'm glad I could sneak on for a little bit with you here.
um, so, I guess let's start with this. How have the New Orleans Saints treated their salary cap different to other teams over the last few years? And why? Why have they taken the approach that they've taken versus a lot of other teams?
So they've just pushed more money into the future than pretty much any other team in the league. There's some other teams that do this as well. Philadelphia and Cleveland are the two that really come to mind. But the Saints have been the team that's really done it the most. And I feel as if the Saints they were a team that probably didn't have to do this a couple of years ago. And they really opted into this, even though they really weren't in a position to do it. It's not like they were really, a great team. They weren't really a Super Bowl contender. But they just kind of went down this path, and it got to the point where, it's almost like a, snowball effect, and you just can't stop doing it simply because you get to a point where you just can't push any more money. You just can't function without restructuring the deals. And, I looked at them as a team that I know I made a comment on Twitter, I think it was, or X, whatever they want to call it nowadays, a couple of weeks ago, which I think a couple of Saints fans didn't like, that it was just that their organization is like 20 years behind in the way they manage things than just about any other team in the NFL. And they remind me a bit of the Raiders of like 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, where, you're just doubling and tripling down on a bunch of older players, and, you're just pushing and pushing and pushing salary cap troubles by doing that. And I think I think they just couldn't say no. I think they were just very optimistic about the chances of the team. And obviously it hasn't panned out. They really haven't been a factor in the last couple of years. And this year it's gone way worse than I would have ever expected it to go.
So is this all like what is the root cause of this? Was this kind because people speculated that at the time when Drew Brees was getting towards the end of his career and they were like, let's try and get one more, right? We got that one Super Bowl win. Drew Brees deserves another ring. Let's try and get one more championship before he's gone. And who knows what kind of situation we're going to be in a quarterback. Was that where it started? And then they just kind of got out of control and couldn't ever pull back and just kept going and going and going? Or has this been a much longer term approach to this whole thing?
I'd say this has been a longer term approach. If you go back to where they were 2014, 15, 16, it's somewhere in that mid range there where kind of Drew Brees was in his prime, and they weren't qualifying for the playoffs. Every year they were, I think, 7-9, and they went out there and did a couple of bad contracts. And I think at the time, over a 3-year period, if I remember right, their dead money was basically the equivalent of one entire year salary cap. At the time, that was probably $150 million that they had in dead money over a 3-year period. Now, I think it was in 2017, they went out and they had that great draft, and that kind of hid a lot of those problems because it gave them an influx of really cheap talent that came in, and you kind of got past that. But they still kind of went with that same strategy. I think they just looked at it like, okay, that really wasn't a problem. We signed players we shouldn't have signed. Excuse me there. I think that was like the Jairus Byrd, Kobe Fleener, Junior Gillette kind of free agent and extension little era. And I think they just looked at it like, we're going to do a little bit of a better job with our contracts. And they've done a better job with their contracts in terms of the valuations that they give their players, with the exception of Taysom Hill. That's a whole different story. But, pretty much everything else, I think it's rare to say that they have a bad contract on their hands. It's just kind of that overall philosophy ends up just being one bad decision in terms of trying to make a an entire team. But they kind of stayed with that same philosophy that they had for that period where they got in cap trouble before, and they just kind of kept doing it and doing it and doing it. So I would say for them, this has been something that, really has gone on for about 10 years or so. And they just got out of it once simply because of basically the nature of that draft class. And since that time, the draft classes have not been good.
Yeah, there was a 2-year period, 2016 and 2017. Their draft classes were pretty crazy. Everyone focuses on 2017, and rightly so. That's genuinely one of the greatest drafts any team has ever had. They had, what was it, half a dozen draft picks. Marshon Lattimore, first round. Ryan Ramczyk, first round. Marcus Williams, second round. Alvin Kamara, Alex Anzalone, Trey Hendrickson, all in the third round. And then Al-Qadim Muhammad in the sixth. Those are all solid or better NFL players, and some of them were absolute superstars. Now, okay, they went on to better things outside of New Orleans in some cases, but in terms of just pure talent identification, that was crazy. But then the year before, 2016, Sheldon Rankins in the first, Michael Thomas in the second, Von Bell in the second, and David Onyemata in the fourth. I mean, those are also 4 high-end NFL starters at minimum. That's a 2-year run of absolutely nailing the draft in terms of evaluations. That almost certainly warped their perception of some things, right? Because all of a sudden you've got 10 players that are on rookie contracts, in most cases, extremely small rookie contracts because they're outside of the first round. And that's going to change your perception of everything to do with the cap.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, when you think you're always going to hit in the draft, and we've seen him make some aggressive moves, right? When they traded up for a tackle a couple of years ago, which was I thought it was crazy, but
right.
That's that idea that you have in your head, like we can kind of do no wrong. And this is always going to be the savior for us. So we can, we have that ability to go in and, keep Cam Jordan here for however long, keep Demario Davis for however long, keep all these players that are getting older and older and older and do these deals with them, because we're always going to be able to draft better than the other teams in the league. But again, all you're doing is you're just kind of relying on that 2-year window, which, I mean, I think everyone agrees that, there's a little bit of luck that goes into the draft. And, they really got lucky. Obviously all these teams put in a lot of work. I don't want to, take away from that, but there has to be some luck sometimes that you're not getting those busts in there that everybody basically gets at some point in time. And, all those names that you rattled off there, I mean, they were tremendous.
So when I've described the salary cap previously, I have kind of talked about this idea that the Saints have treated it like a credit card, right? Where they would rack up this giant bill, and then March comes around and you've got to get cap compliant, and they just pay off the credit card, they restructure, they get rid of some players, they clear the debt, and then they do it all over again. Whereas other teams tend to treat it more like a debit card where you're kind of operating in the current year. Why is it different now? Why have they kind of run out of road when it comes to just paying off the credit card, redoing it, and starting over? How has it kind of compounded and become an acute problem as opposed to just something that they can permanently keep kicking the can down the road on?
So I think it's the two things. One is you didn't have those draft picks to kind of, I don't know, insulate the team from certain salary cap issues. So when you don't have those draft picks that come in and you don't want to go into a rebuilding phase, what's the next thing that you do? You kind of go back in there in free agency and you sign some players, whether it's a Carr or Matthew, guys that probably should not be bringing in at maybe this stage of their career or the stage of where you are as an organization, where you should be looking to turn the page, rebuild, get younger. You're going in there and you're signing a, $35-40 million a year quarterback who, his best days are long behind him, with the Raiders. And I think that's really what happened to them there, is because of the draft picks that didn't pan out. They went into free agency, they signed some players, and they never wanted to let go of anybody on their team. And in some cases they couldn't. The guys who they really let go, it was basically when their contracts just ran out. Armstead's contract just runs out. and he doesn't want to resign, so you're going to
Right.
lose him. Hendrickson's contract runs out. You can't afford to keep a player like that, so you can't re-sign him. And that's kind of the way that they lose their players at this point. And really, if you look at the roster now, that's probably what's going to happen. Is you're looking at 2026, which is when a lot of the players have their contracts kind of void out, and unless some of them opt to retire next year, that's really the year that you're looking at some of the players just falling off naturally from the roster. But they've put themselves in that position to where they don't have that same flexibility as the other teams in the league to just come in there and say, okay, we're going to cut, these 3 players. It just doesn't work within their salary cap structure anymore.
So how bad a situation is this now? Because I think everyone's kind of gotten numb to the idea of like every time you fire up over the cap and you look at the salary cap space, the Saints are always, negative 100 million in cap space. And everyone's just immune to those numbers at this stage. But trading away Marshon Lattimore for very little in terms of cap saving, right? But it's a cash saving and it's a draft pick exercise. I mean, that's the kind of move that indicates like a serious rebuild, the kind of proper tear it down, structural start over thing that people have been saying was coming down the line for a long time for the Saints. Have the walls finally caved in? Is this where they are now? This is a serious tear it down rebuild.
Yeah, I think that's probably what they're heading in. And the thing is, the decisions that they made all these last 2-3 years, it's going to kind of force them to, if players don't retire, run out there with this same group of players that is just getting killed every week, not playing very well. And it's probably just going to be worse next year. Everyone is going to be a year older that's going to be on that team. And you're probably looking at a 2-year period where you have to kind of, rip the roster apart piece by piece by piece before you can kind of get in there and start to fix things. When it comes to your financial structure and everything else. And, this isn't the first team that this has happened to, right? This happened to the Raiders,
Right.
it happened to the Falcons, the Bears, the Panthers. This is probably the worst. And maybe the Raiders were probably worse in like 2013, 2014. But this is way up there. And it's probably going to be a pretty hard pill to swallow if you're a Saints fan, because you're going to go from thinking you're a contender to really going into a rebuild where, unless you really, again, you hit it all in the draft and everyone plays great as a rookie, you're going to be in that period where you're just throwing a bunch of undrafted players on the field because that's what you can afford to fill out your roster. And, you're going to probably have some veterans that are unhappy that are on a team that has nowhere to go. You're not looking at it as like a exercise in hope for next year. It's more like, how do we get to 2026 and get our hands on a quarterback by that point in time? And then how do we grow from there?
It does feel like this, like teams used to get into salary cap hell kind of all the time, right? At the start of the salary cap era where nobody really knew how it worked yet. And everyone was just kind of, it was like the Wild West, right? And some teams went nuts and then, complete salary cap nightmare, tear it all down, full rebuild. It does feel like in recent years, teams the league over have gotten a lot better at avoiding that. Like everyone generally seems to understand now, this is how it works. This is what you can and can't do. Here are the guardrails. Like we stay within these and we're okay. And the prospect of teams going into like full salary cap hell sort of seemed like it had gone away. And then along come the Saints with this approach of maxing out the credit card, and all of a sudden they seem like this is a move from like '05. You know what I mean? It's like the Saints have jumped back in history 20 years to the stage where people didn't really understand how the salary cap worked yet.
Yeah, I think, and that goes back to what I was saying before, where I said they're like 20 years behind everybody else in the league. And they have a good person that manages their cap and negotiates their contracts and everything else. So they do have someone that specializes in that, and he's actually good. But when you have a general manager that comes in and says, well, we just got to make the numbers work, and it's reminiscent of that era that you're talking about, really, where the coaches ran a lot of the organizations. And, you'd have the guys like
Right.
Parcells running the team, and, they'd come in there and just be like, get it done.
Yeah.
I'm a
He
Jets
didn't care.
fan,
He's just
so,
like, get me this player.
it's like,
make it work.
I want this. If Curtis Martin is 31 years old and I think he can still run, I don't care
Right.
what he wants. Get him here. And I think the Saints, and they've had a GM with a very, very long, championship career from before. It's a different era of football, and I think that they've kind of gone into that other era where these other teams have, they all hire people nowadays to really manage it, run it. Obviously, some teams invest a lot more than others. You've got the analytics that come into it now, where teams really understand the fact that once a player is over, depending on the position, for many 28 years old, 29 years old, you want to have escape routes in these contracts, not signing players to big new deals. So teams have gotten away from that, and that rookie salary cap structure has helped too, because you don't run into the problem of those top 10 picks getting those gigantic contracts, not panning out, and then you still owe them. Nowadays it'd be probably like you still owe them $100 million, even though they can't play football. So teams have kind of been saved a little bit by that. But yeah, the Saints, the way that they've operated has been, that 20 years behind in terms of just get me whoever. And, I don't think it's any surprise that Sean Payton left the team when he did. I think he saw the writing on the wall for where these things were headed, how long it was going to take to rebuild it. And it's better just pull away, find another team, and, see if you can do something there.
And when Peyton was there was always this interesting kind of gray area of like, how much is his responsibility, right? Like, how much is him? How much is Mickey Loomis? Who's making all these decisions? Who's responsible for the situation that they're in? Peyton jumps off a sinking ship, and now like all of the blame starts to focus in on Mickey Loomis. And where that becomes tricky is, I mean, he's the guy that's going to get tasked with putting it back together, right? If he's the one that's taken this approach, like, are they able to kind of completely change tack, tear it down, and take a very different approach to how they've dealt with the salary cap for the last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't know. I would imagine that the answer to that is yes. I think just the fact that you saw what happened with Latimore today, the fact that they were willing to trade him, I have to think that that's like an admission that, okay, yeah, we understand now. We've got to do this now. Obviously, they did the deal a couple weeks ago with the running back, where you go, what are they doing?
Right.
But I think this trade and just the fact that there's not a lot of options. I mean, at this point, when your team gets to be bad, like, even if you're the most optimistic person in the world, okay, this is a bad football team, and I can't keep doubling down on these players. There is an exit ramp for some of them next year, most of them in 2026. So I think he can probably do that. He's a football lifer. So I would think if he's, come to that realization, which I think you have to, I would think that he can do it. Now, 4 years from now, we're probably having this discussion again about what are they doing again, pushing all this money. But at that point in time, maybe they have a young infrastructure of players in there where, it kind of hides it, or, allows them to get away with it the way that other teams around the league do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point, the Latimore thing, because it's not like that gives them an amazing immediate cap relief, right? Like, if it would be one thing if that was the kind of move where, okay, that frees up a ton of cap space, and you can still be business as usual with that approach.
It's break even.
Yeah,
that's all it is. They save a couple $100,000 this year. They lose a couple $100,000 next year. So, I mean, it pretty much just nets out to even. And that is not a move that they would have made a couple weeks ago, to be honest.
Yeah. It's a very un-New Orleans Saints move. They're basically shipping him out for draft picks and to rip the Band-Aid off, right? This idea that they save cash, they take all the pain next year, and then they can start putting the roster in good order going forward. And from Washington's perspective, it ends up being a steal. I mean, they get a team that's actually really good all of a sudden, surprisingly so this year, with a real weakness. A cornerback gets to add a high-level corner for mid-round draft picks. It's they're giving up a third and a fourth round pick. It's offset by a fifth round pick coming back the other way, and a sixth rounder. So whatever that sort of tallies up to in the trade value chart, it's a pretty good deal for a guy as good as Marshon Lattimore.
Yeah, I think so, especially when you consider it's very clearly a playoff type of season for Washington right now. So when you have that unexpected year, that's the time where you should be making these types of moves.
The other thing that it does is potentially signal like the other way out of these types of salary cap hell situations is good drafts, right? We talked about how those 2017, 2016 drafts were insanely good. It maybe made it worse because it sort of taught them that they could actually get away with this as long as they had those types of draft, but it could also dig you out of a hole. You're not going to repeat the 2017 draft, right? That just insane strike rate. But what you can do is draft 15 times and maybe you get 5 players of the same caliber because you drafted 15 times. The strike rate is not going to be batting 1,000, but maybe this is the Marshon Lattimore thing is an indication that they've got that understanding as well. That, the way out of this is the draft. And the way of actually hitting on the draft is draft a lot of times.
Yep, I would think so. You get those high volume of picks that come in there, and hopefully you can, turn them in. If you get those 6 picks, hopefully you can get 2 players out of there that, work out as starters.
So I guess the last question surrounding this whole thing, or the elephant in the room from a Saints perspective, is where does this lead them at quarterback and Derek Carr, right? That was the stopgap. The guy, this is a good enough team to win right now. If we just have a guy as good as Derek Carr, Carr comes in. It didn't really work last year. The start was so bad that by the time he got into his groove, they were too far behind. And then this year he's got hurt. Everything's fallen apart. They've lost 7 straight. The whole thing's a disaster. So now we got to rip it up. We got to start over. What do they do at quarterback?
So I would imagine that decision has been made that they're going to move on from him. Now he has $50 million in dead money. So
Right.
I think what they have to do is go in there in December. They owe him $10 million still. Probably pay him that money this year as a signing bonus, just to get that $10 million off the books. And then that'll give him the opportunity to June 1 him next year. What they'll do is they'll take his base salary that he has on the books right now, which is 30 or 35 million. They'll reduce that down to the minimum. Let's just call it 1.5, so that they're going to shave off a good 30 million or so from his cap number. And then they'll just defer a good chunk of all that dead money, probably about 30 million or so into 2026. Yeah, about 28 million they'll defer in there. So I think you'll see them do something with his contract in December, and that'll just signal that they're giving themselves the ability to June 1 him in March, because the way his contract is now, they can't June 1 him and keep him as a $50 million cap hit until June. That just won't work out.
So is this all, are the Saints effectively going to do this over 2 years, put themselves in with a ton of dead money for both 2025 and 2026, and then get back, they can sort of actually be a normal salary cap team again from that point on?
Yeah, I think so. I think you'll just see them carry a ton of dead money next year, and then even more in 2026. And you'll see a lot of roster changes next year, and then 2026 is really when you'll see just everybody that's there right now probably completely drops off the team.
All right. Anything else you think we should know about this Saints salary cap situation? Anything else I haven't asked you already that I should have?
No, I don't think so. It's a lot of the same story every year. So I think it's always kind of an entertaining thing to look at, and it's a little bit of educational too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I thought they actually had a handle on how to manage this year on year because they've done it for so long and been able to keep kicking the can down the road. Turns out the piper has to get paid at some point, and here it is. So thanks very much, Jason, for coming on and educating me and hopefully some of our listeners as well.
No, thank you very much for having me on, and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Absolutely. Sounds good.